After 7 military coups in 3 years in West and Central Africa, could Gabon's election set the example for democracy? Coup leader Brice Oligui Nguema took more than 90% of the presidential ballot, but in spite of opposition complaints, the streets remained calm. So will Gabon set itself on a path toward prosperity and transparency? Or will this distant cousin of the Bongo dynasty move the country back toward one-man rule? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's Newsmaker is Gabon. Half a century with one family in power. Omar Bongo and his son Ali ruled Gabon until 2023, when Ali Bongo was overthrown by the very military charged with his protection. After a peaceful election on Saturday, the man who led that coup was elected president by an almost unbelievable margin. But it seems most Gabonese are not complaining and are actually eager to give Nguema a chance as an elected leader. So how will he manage Gabon's fortunes, not least its vast oil wealth? And will he rid the country of the corruption that he's also been accused of? Here's a look.
This is not what was seen in 2016. This time, no protests, no violence. For this election, the streets of Libreville are filled with something other than tear gas and tension. Instead, hope.
It's the first time we've had internet. We don't have a curfew. We can talk freely. The ballot counting was transparent. Really, we're happy. Normally, we are closed in our houses and afraid of violence.
Gabonese polls have long been a flashpoint. In 2016, allegations of fraud under President Ali Bongo sparked days of unrest that saw the national parliament being set on fire, leaving dozens dead or missing.
We want another name, anything but Bongo. That was the case in 2016, that was the case in 2023, and when we arrived in 2025, it's a new Gabon. It's a new republic and a real one.
For over half a century, the Bongo family defined Gabon's political landscape. Omar Bongo seized power in 1967 and ruled until his death in 2009, while his son Ali Bongo extended their reign. But after a disputed election in 2023, when Ali Bongo's victory was quickly annulled by the military, the country was thrown into a power vacuum. In that moment, General Brice Oligui Nguema, then head of the Republican Guard, emerged as the new force behind Gabon's future. Nguema traded his uniform for a suit and took charge as interim president. And now, in Gabon's first election since the coup, he secured an overwhelming mandate, winning over 90% of the vote against 7 other candidates.
During the election campaign, and I told you, there is no happiness without effort. Tomorrow is a working day. We must now turn the page on the presidential election. Let us be builders of peace and justice.
Nguema calls it the dawn of a fifth republic, a break from the past, a promise of reform. Even for the opposition, it's not just about who won, it's about the kind of democracy Gabon wants to build.
À l'ensemble de mes compatriotes.
To all my compatriots, I make a solemn call. Let's reject the absolutist drift. Let's reject the one-track thinking. Let's reject fear becoming the norm. Together, let us pave the way for a return to true democracy, where pluralism can no longer be a danger, but an asset.
Gabon remains a paradox. Though blessed with vast oil wealth and some of the world's most pristine forests, widespread poverty, high unemployment and soaring debt tell a different story. With parliament dissolved and the judiciary still in transition, the country's deep structural challenges persist. The dynasty has fallen, and for now the streets are calm. But the real test of Gabon's republic lies not in the vote count, but in what comes next.
So to debate what comes next for Gabon, as well as the integrity of their election, are from London, consulting fellow at Chatham House's Africa program, Melly, And from Abidjan, David Otto, the director for the Geneva Center for Africa Security and Strategic Studies. Thanks all so much, both so much for being with me. I'm going to begin by asking how much confidence the Gabonese should really have in this new leader. You know, he'd been very close to the Bongo family for years. He's been accused of corruption, though, mostly for buying pretty expensive properties in the United States. So is he the person to give Gabon a new start? Paul, go ahead.
I think what's interesting about him is that he's realized that there's both a huge appetite for change, but that there's a way of achieving the route to that change, if you like, without bringing the whole building down. So he's used the system. He's brought the actual Gabonese political elite, the political class, including not only opponents, but also quite a lot of people who were involved or close to the government that was overthrown in the 30th August 2023 coup. He's brought all those together. He's realized also that it may work to Gabon's advantage to have the support of the country's traditional allies, France, the EU, of course, the US. There's a bit of an open question, but that's about American politics, really, rather than, but in particular African countries. But he's realized that there's a way of moving forward into a new era, and it can be smoothly managed, if you like. But the big test will be what does he do next? But the shrewdness, if you like, the political facility with which he's managed this process, and yeah, he has used the old regime as a political machine to some extent, obviously, to ensure a really thumping victory. But there isn't much doubt that he was the very clear winner of the election anyway. That's a real skill.
He's used the system, though, better to, his counterparts in the other countries where, in West and Central Africa, where coups have taken place?
Well, yeah. I mean, there have been some complaints that perhaps one of the important potential challengers, trade unionist Jean-Rémy Yama, was shut out of the race because he couldn't produce his father's birth certificate, which was one of the bureaucratic requirements. But overall, it has been a fairly open, pluralistic political process, and there is open debate, and critics are able to speak out in the political arena, in the media. That's not true in the other countries that have had military coups, where conditions have been much, much more difficult. And there are people who, for example, you've got in many countries really difficult, serious human rights problems. And there's no plural politics at all at the moment. Okay. So that's a big difference.
So, David, would you agree there? And, I mean, we have to remember, as I said, he's still, a cousin of the Bongo family. So are there enough degrees of separation to make sure that he does things in a different way?
Well, I think there isn't any doubt that, a president Brice, who has, been, of course, turned himself, from a general to a president, was very close to the Bongos, but not just close, being a family member. And many Gabonese, saw that, as some kind of a continuation of the Bongo dynasty, and that was a big doubt in terms of whether there was going to be, or this was just a continuation from maybe, as some have described it, a greater evil against a lesser one. So it now depends, again, as to what his policies are going to be. He wants to portray himself as kind of the one who, came to, kind of save the country from a dynasty, which is very difficult, especially with the fact that he was also a beneficiary of the previous government under, Ali Bongo. So I think, he's going to struggle. perhaps, to distance himself, from the past, dynasty, because of course, again, as I mentioned, he was a beneficiary of it.
Yeah.
But it now depends, beyond the danks, that he has portrayed during the campaign, for him to come up with, policies that will demonstrate. But I think, from
Okay.
the opposition side, some of the fact that he will be running for 7 years, the fact that he has been accused of trying to prevent the opposition from having the same level playing field during the campaign period, are already signs that we could see I think two sides of the same coin, kind of scenario.
Yeah, and I mean, Paul, on that, I mean, some are saying in spite of the different faces that participated in the election, this was still overall an election for the elite. So do the poor have any buy-in this time? And how dramatic, would reforms really have to be to satisfy the wider public, especially along the lines of, getting electricity up and working, getting water services sorted, as well as education?
Well, that is in some ways the really big challenge that faces Oligui Nguema now, because although Gabon has oil and it has a small population, plenty of natural resources, it's the world's second biggest producer of manganese, for example. It has one of the most biodiverse parts of the Congo Basin rainforest, has great potential for a small population. Its track record on development and delivery of basic services for ordinary people is really disappointing when you take into account those resources and the fact that it's also peaceful. A study by one of the major development agencies a few years ago concluded that it had one of, as it were, relative to the means available, it had one of the poorest records of service delivery, basic service delivery in sub-Saharan Africa. So that's going to be a really big challenge. How to do that without completely alienating that political class, that political elite, whose support, as it were, has facilitated his entry to power, because it's going to, the top officials who are used to being very well paid, and I'm not talking about corruption, I'm just talking about normal mains, the elite are very well treated, very well rewarded, that sort of wider urban governing elite, if you like, top officials and so on, and how to shift the balance so that more resources go to rural communities and the urban poor. That's going to be a tough challenge.
And David, do you think he'll be able to meet that challenge while keeping the support, if you believe it's necessary, of not just the elite, but, balancing the controversial role of France in Gabon as well? He has a lot of factors to play here. Do you think he can do that?
I think it's going to depend again on, what he actually does. Again, as you mentioned, in terms of, his foreign policy, particularly with France, how he manages that. We've already seen, some signs of him, for example, nationalizing, some oil companies, including the Asala Energy, which, of course, has links with the US and France. So there is some kind of an atmosphere for him that perhaps he would be watching very closely, especially in terms of how the population regards France, not just in Gabon but in the region, which of course it's not anything to write home about. So I think what he would do, possibly is to watch very closely in terms of how the population reacts, bearing in mind that he's coming from an illegitimacy to legitimacy, in terms of getting power through a military coup. So this is something that one needs to see in terms of what policies he brings forth. But I think the early signs are already showing that he may want to stay a little bit clear from, the French syndrome, which is going around the continent. Especially if he has any feelings or he sees any signs that, the plague that, is falling against the French especially in the Sahel, perhaps, could be driving towards Gabon. So let's see how it goes.
Yeah, I mean, Paul, where do you stand on that? Because, David called it the French syndrome, but France hasn't proven very popular in large swathes of Africa now as a former colonial power. Everything from the language to its participation in business is being pushed out. And here we see Gabon starting to nationalize more of its, natural resource industries. Where do you see that going, and how important really is it for Gabon's development?
Well, I think this is where Oligui Nguema is trying to make a difficult balancing act. It's interesting that the nationalization, it didn't just include Asala, it also included Tullow, which is a British company. And I think that message was certainly in response to this mood that one can see more generally across West and Central Africa, where there's a popular demand for Africa to keep more control of its own resources, more control of its policies, its destinies, its investments, decisions. But at the same time, the Gabon government has been very strong, very, very firm in asserting that France remains a very close partner. And it's interesting that Paris also is reading the new mood, and some weeks ago, very recently, but in the run-up to this election, Gabon and France finalized an agreement under which the French military base in Libreville, the Gabonese capital, which is called Camp de Gaulle, so named after the famous French president, General de Gaulle, is going to be handed over, and it's going to become a military training center where both countries will have officers working together, military specialists working together in training, not just soldiers, but also guards to protect the forest and the wildlife. And it's going to be renamed with a Gabonese name. Now, that may sound like kind of quite a niche thing, but it's the sort of thing that ordinary people in the street in Gabon will see. They will notice that sort of re-signing, that visible shift in balance. And the test, and I think this is where an awful lot hangs on Oligui Nguema's ability to take things forward and improve living conditions and services for ordinary people, because he would like France to remain a key ally, but it's actually in the interests of both Gabon and France that his development strategy succeeds so that people's everyday life gets better.
When you look at that development strategy, though, David, we keep referring to Gabon in the context of West and Central Africa, but there might be another even better example for the potential future of Gabon, and that's in Southern Africa and Zimbabwe. We saw, again there, someone from the inside really take over in what was a military coup, and then we saw Zimbabwe move forward really stagnating and very little done, very little interest taken in what was supposed to be what people had hoped would be a real revolution for the country in addressing the issues of poverty and development. Do you fear that could be the same model in Gabon, or is it completely different?
Well, I think, we do hope that, it's quite different. Unfortunately, history has proven in many African countries that, the military, it's not very good in terms of governance, and, they've proven that in several countries, including the likes of Nigeria. You did mention Zimbabwe as well, with President Emerson Mnangagwa. But not just that, I think also the problem becomes one of repetition. A lot of countries do not want to clearly see themselves, giving, open hands and embrace, to someone who, took power unconstitutionally and then, turns himself into a president, from a democratic process, just like we've seen in the case of Chad, So I think, it's not just about the challenge that himself, as as now a democratically elected president, will face, from his own personal policies, or perhaps from the policies of, his executive members. But it's also, from, an external point. Do countries really want to see themselves being associated, with Gabon, bearing in mind that, there is condemnation in the Sahel with, other countries, other members of the military who have taken power from democratic. So it's a very complex scenario. But again, we know that geopolitics is all about interest. As long as, internal and external interests are aligned, I think, there will always be a very fine narrative, in terms of, how it is framed.
Yeah.
But again, I think my preoccupation is that, the train is still on the station. Let's wait for it to depart. And see what destination it takes.
Yeah, but I mean, I'll come back to Paul, because if we do look at the history of Gabon a little bit more, the recent history as well, and if we look toward foreign policy and foreign investment, we know that the oil industry is considered a somewhat dying industry, and that has been the source of Gabon's wealth for so long. So if we have to look at development for Gabon in the sense of what other industries are there, many have suggested tourism could be a great sector for Gabon to explore, but Gabon has been pretty isolated in many ways and hasn't let a lot of foreign investment really come in, aside from the oil industry, and a lot of visitors, for that matter, come in. So would that be an industry for Gabon to first start developing? And do you think the population and the government is ready for that, to really let foreigners come in?
I think actually they are. I think it's partly that they were for a very, very long time in a sort of comfortable niche, that they have this small population, they have all this resources, they not just oil, not just manganese, but this huge tract of forest, in which they have established, I think it's 10 national parks. So there is a really serious record on conservation and biodiversity. But the challenge, therefore, is to say, whereas before they didn't really feel they needed to push it. So they were doing these things because it made sense, and actually also it brought diplomatic benefits. The previous president, Ali Bongo, was very highly regarded for his interest in biodiversity, whatever other weaknesses his government had. But they didn't feel under economic pressure to really develop that sector and to really diversify. And food production is another area. Although Gabon sits astride the equator and has the climate and the available land to produce much more of its own food, it is extraordinarily reliant on food imported from neighboring Cameroon. Basic staples that could perfectly well be grown in Gabon. Agriculture has just not been prioritized in the past. So I think now they're really going to need to have a really hard-headed focus on how to develop these other structures, other sectors, because, of course, like many countries in Africa, there's a huge youth population, a very, very large number of people coming into the job market each year, and they need either paid employed jobs or viable livelihoods.
Yeah.
And actually, even if the oil sector wasn't under some pressure, it isn't necessarily that huge an employer. After all, oil rigs are mostly offshore. They're very high tech.
And I mean, David, just our last minute here. I mean, some of these investment opportunities in Gabon, agriculture, fish farming, tourism, I mean, they seem like no-brainers. But do you think, honestly, what's your instinct telling you? Will we see them developed?
I think we may. Again, if I have to speak on behalf of the president from a point of what he said in his campaign, Gabon, does have the potentials, in terms of the natural resources, as my co-panelist mentioned, enormous, the rainforest, agricultural potential, but I think the most strategic advantage that Gabon does have is that it has a very small population, which means it's very easy or easier comparative to other African countries to manage, but also to satisfy. So I think, from my point of view, from an economic point of view, this is going to be something which perhaps, the president should explore and exploit, that he runs a country that is not as large as Nigeria, for example, or Cameroon, which is a neighboring country. So again, it is left for the president, to fulfill the promises which he's made, during campaign, to uplift the country, to act differently from the previous government, which he overthrew, but also to convince the population of Gabon and the international community that there is some benefit when you become a legitimate president from an illegitimate source.
Okay, yeah, I like how you say it should be easy, or at least easier. We'll see if the new leadership takes those real steps to get some development into the country and better investment into the country. So that will have to be the final word, though, David. That's all the time we have for this edition of the Newsmakers. So I'd like to thank really both of you, Paul and David, so much for being with me, and our viewers, of course, for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on social media, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We will see you next time.